So in the coming videos, I'm going to lay out some of the questions that I have in looking at the story of the Exodus carefully. Two kinds of questions. Questions about how the Exodus took place, some strange oddities in the way things took place. Why did they have to happen that way? And also, as we begin to understand the hows, trying to get to understand some of the whys. Was it really just about getting the Jews free, or was something else going on? I want you to come with me into a somewhat more detailed look at what actually went on in the Exodus. When we actually read it, I think we'll find some very surprising things indeed. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about the Exodus story itself. And again, I want to invite you to sort of play if you were God. If you were God, would it really have taken you 10 plagues to get the Jews out of Egypt? This, I think, is a very significant question, and I think the answer for most of us would be no. I mean, we could have thought of much more creative ways to get the Jews out of Egypt, simpler ways, than actually requiring 10 whole different plagues to make this happen. I mean, even if you had gone to the 10th plague, the last plague, and done that first, it might have done the trick. That's sort of the atom bomb of the plagues. Why wait till the 10th plague? That could have perhaps done it all on its own. But even without any 10 plagues, I mean, even if you were sort of a pacifist God and you didn't want to have any plagues at all, you could just sort of Alibaba the Jews out with a magic carpet and let the Jews go without any bloodshed whatsoever, without any plagues whatsoever. Just very simple. And by the way, if you think, well, that's really fairy tale, it couldn't really have happened, it could have happened. And as a matter of fact, there were plagues that actually took place within these 10 plagues, which had the makings of the sort of magic carpet trick. And of course, what I'm referring to here is the Great Plague of Darkness. Now, in the Plague of Darkness, what happens? Well, the Egyptians are stricken with darkness. They can't see a blasted thing. The Jews have light. They can see whatever they want. What better opportunity could you possibly imagine for the Jews to simply slip out of Egypt without the Egyptians knowing a thing? If we were worried about the Jews being hit by some random arrows, we can actually invoke another thing which happens when the Jews are going out of Egypt and they're confronted at the sea by a pursuing Egyptian army. So then God sort of erects the equivalent of a force field, has the pillar of cloud separating between the Jews and the Egyptians, and the pillar of cloud absorbs all the threatening arrows from the Egyptians, because just sort of, combined the pillar of cloud over here with the plague of darkness, and we're good. The Jews are fine. They can leave. Why bother with these very elaborate 10 plagues? It's just completely not necessary. Okay, so let's continue with this theme, if you were God. It actually leads us to a couple other questions as we continue to sort of to follow the story of the Exodus. So remember at the beginning, Pharaoh and Moses begin their face-off with Moshe asking for 3 days. Just let us go for 3 days. We'll serve God and we'll come back. Now, again, think, if you were God, why would you put Moshe up to that? I mean, let's just face it, it's not nice to say it, but isn't that a lie? If you have the power to set the Jews free, I mean, why don't you take the stance, look, send the Jews free and let them go? If you think about the sort of the stylized Hollywood portraits of the Exodus, like the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston or the Prince of Egypt, Steven Spielberg, they don't have the 3 days. I mean, that gets left on the cutting room floor, but in the actual Bible, it's there. Why ask Pharaoh for 3 days? Why don't you just say, let my people go, and then that's it? Now, as a kind of follow-up to that question, we might ask the same thing about these sort of lengthy bargaining sessions between Moses and Pharaoh. If you look carefully at the Exodus story, there are these long sort of haggling sections. Moshe says, I want the Jews to go. And Pharaoh says, well, who do you want to go? Maybe just take the men. So Moses says, no, we got to take everybody. So Pharaoh says, well, okay, you take everybody, but why don't you leave your kids behind? No, we got to bring our kids too. So Pharaoh gets angry, and then there's another plague. It gets even more ridiculous at the very end. So Pharaoh says, fine, you can all go, but just leave your your cattle behind. Moses says, well, no, we got to take our cattle. Not only that, you got to give us cattle. We have no idea what we're going to serve God with until we go out. Who knows? Maybe he'll ask to sacrifice hippopotamuses, giraffes. We got to take everyone. We're not going to leave a hoof behind. I mean, this is the language that Moses uses when arguing with Pharaoh, and it just sort of almost seems like a farce. I mean, again, if you were God and you have all this power, you don't need any of these bargaining sessions. You don't even need Pharaoh's agreement at all. The 3 days, and the bargaining sessions together really seem to suggest that the Jews, for some reason, aren't going anywhere unless Pharaoh says they can go. If that's true, why does God harden Pharaoh's heart? Right? You may be familiar enough with the Exodus story to know that even though at the beginning of the story, Paro changes his mind all the time, whenever it is that he's agreed to let the Jews go after one plague and another plague, he changes his mind. But towards the end of the story, God actually gets involved and hardens Pharaoh's heart, seems to divinely mess with Pharaoh's free will and changes Paro's mind. Now, why would he do that? When I say why would he do that, I don't mean from a moral standpoint, why would he do that? That's a very interesting question, but that's not the question I'm asking now. The question I'm really asking is a tactical question. If you're God, and we care about Pharaoh's will, when Pharaoh finally says yes, Pharaoh's consent is important, so don't go changing his mind. I mean, you've gotten what you want. So what are we to conclude? That maybe we don't care about Pharaoh's consent. Well, if we don't care about Pharaoh's consent, then don't bother trying to get his consent in the first place. This is a very important question. Either it's this, or it's this. I mean, do you care about his consent, or don't you care about his consent? The truth is, this whole issue of Pharaoh's free will and kind of unraveling the role of Pharaoh's will and consent within our story is a tough one which we'll come back to. If you look at the text, here I have one of the verses that discusses God sort of changing Pharaoh's mind. Now look at the language. Vayar paro ki chadala matar v'barad v'kolot. This is after the plague of hail. Pharaoh saw that the hail was off. There was no more hail. Vayosef lachto, and he continued to sin. Vayachbed libo huva avadav. Now look at this language over here. Vayachbed libo huva avadav. It literally means, and he hardened his heart, he and his servants. But if you pay attention to that word, the shorish over here is kaved. He hardened his heart. What's strange about it is it's not the only word that is used to describe this process of the changing of Pharaoh's mind. So for example, take a look at this verse over here. Vaychazek Hashem et leiv paro. Oh, that's interesting. That's a different word. Chazak. God sort of strengthened his heart. Here over here in English, you have it mistranslated as hardened in both cases, but you can see very clearly is different, right? In one case, I have vayachbed, kaved, chaf, veit, daled, and over here I have vaychazek, chazak, which actually mean two different things. So these are mistranslations. There should be two different translations. So the question is, what's the best translations of these words, right? Chazak actually literally means to strengthen, and vayachbed probably does mean to harden. So the question is, what is the difference between these things, and are there two different processes going on? I think there are two different processes going on, and if you look carefully throughout the plagues, you'll notice something else too, which is that sometimes God is the one doing the hardening or the changing of mind, and sometimes it's not so clear. Sometimes it is actually Pharaoh that seems to be doing it. Over here, Vayachbed libo, he hardened his heart, but it's unclear who the he is. If you actually look carefully, it actually sort of looks like it's Pharaoh. Before we leave this issue of Pharaoh's will, I want to just call your attention to one other thing, and that is this. Over the course of the plagues, Pharaoh sort of goes back and forth, as we've talked about. Now, generally speaking, in these times when Pharaoh capitulates to Moses, does he say, oh, well, I'm sorry, I did a terrible thing, I sinned? Or is it just that he gives in because he says, look, you won and you can go? Right? It's a different thing to surrender because you think you were wrong than to surrender because you think that you were beaten. So generally speaking, when Pharaoh surrenders after each one of these plagues and then he sort of changes his mind, does he surrender on moral grounds or not? And generally we think the answer is no, of course not, he doesn't, and that's true. But there is one exception. And the exception, strangely enough, comes right over here after plague number 7, the plague of Bara. Look at this language over here. So Paro calls to Moshe and to Aaron, and he says to them, Chatati apam, I have sinned this time. Hashem hatzadik vani va'ami harashaim. God is the righteous one, and me and my people are wicked. I mean, this is moral language. I mean, it seems like Pharaoh, for the first time, is like convinced that he was wrong. I mean, very strange. So one of the things we want to come back to is what was happening in plague number 7 that makes Pharaoh sort of come to this realization that he was wrong on moral terms. And we'll come back to that. But also, I want you to think about the fact that this is very significant for understanding this issue which we've been talking about, which is, what does it mean that God changed Pharaoh's mind, hardened Pharaoh's heart? Because, as I mentioned before, in the beginning of the plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own heart and changes his own mind. Then at a certain point, God is the one who seems to interfere with Pharaoh's free will and changes Pharaoh's mind for him, as it were. Well, when is it that God is the one who starts to harden Pharaoh's heart? It turns out that that happened right after plague number 6, the plague right before this, the plague of boils. Take a look at this. Vaychazek Hashem et leiv Paro. So this is the first time that you really get this language. And God was the one who actually went in and changed Pharaoh's mind. Okay, so isn't it strange then that in the very next plague, Pharaoh morally capitulates and says that he was wrong and says that he sinned? Those are moral words. There's no greater expression of free will than that. What is going on here? If that's the best God can do of depriving Pharaoh of free will, it doesn't look like they did a very good job. How is it that we understand this? So again, the issues involving Pharaoh's free will are very, very complex, and we're going to come back to them. But before we do, we need to treat some other issues too. So let's take a look at some of those other issues now.